Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Proper and this is Victoria 3, and today we're going to be talking about the community feedback for the Dev Diaries 13, 14 and 15. We are going to, of course, be limited here to the comments that were left under my video. I selected the best, but when I say the best, hey, don't feel bad if I didn't select your comment and you thought I should have. Honestly, just make the comment again. Sometimes, you know, I see it from one angle and say we don't necessarily need to discuss that again. Other times, when I see it again, I'm like, oh, I see your angle now, right? So I really love the community discussion here. I always was interested both in CK3 and Victoria 3's community discussions because, of course, at the end of the day, any of these games and any of the videos, any of the discussions that I make are made for the community. We're going to start, of course, with Dev Diary number 13. Now, this is, I assume we're going to see that already when you open the video, going to be a long video. I expect, and I'm just starting recording this, I expect like 2 hours maybe. We're going to see about that. We start with a standard of living. Standard of Living was, of course, a really nice Dev Diary. I personally was very impressed by the changes that they made when it comes to how pops behave, how the distance, or rather difference, between the pop professions in Victoria 3 and the pop types in Victoria 2 are. Grab, you know, I don't know, some coffee, some tea, some orange juice, wink wink, like myself, and just, you know, hang in here, listen to me, and if you disagree, if you agree, feel absolutely free to leave comments. I will, of course, as always, be in the comments. If you don't remember the Dev Diary, I will link it in the description. You know, it was generally just talking about how people consume. They also, I believe, talked in this Dev Diary exactly about cultural obsessions and cultural taboos. Before we jump into that though, especially with today's actual Dev Diary video in mind, there is a new comment by Martin Anwart, so by the game director, in the comments related to the big issue that I have with states. Let's check this out, because I just love this comment so much. A word on how this affects markets. Would the Rhineland states belong, one to the Prussian market and the other to the Bavarian market? Or do they both belong to the Prussian, and as Prussia has the biggest state in the state region? Right now, all states in the same state region share a market, but we're looking at moving this to the state level. Yes! The reason it's on the state region level is because it made sense in earlier versions of the market system. Understandable. I'll be honest with you as well. I didn't actually expect, I'll just say it, I did not expect that they would rework it like this, or even consider reworking it, because honestly, I talked about this extensively in today's video. If you haven't watched it, then I recommend checking it out. And I will say, hey, yeah, I was sad, I am sad about it currently, of course, but it wasn't something where I say this is game breaking, this is game defining. It's just something where I'm saying, you know, the cherry on top could have been to do it via states rather than state regions, and now Wiz comes out of the woodwork and says, we might actually do it via states. So I'm incredibly happy about that. I hope so are you. If you share my concerns, of course, how this actually turns out in the end, we will see. But honestly, quite exciting news. Now, let's jump into number 13. So, standard of living community feedback. Heating needs to be different depending on latitude at least. If a pop in Rio de Janeiro spends a cent in heating, it will be so immersion breaking. So, this has been confirmed on the forums for not really being accounted for, be it harsh winters or just be it, you know, the general climate that you live in. And that is, of course, saddening. Now, I do see the angle of saying it's immersion breaking, because of course it is. Yeah, you don't usually use that stuff to do these sort of tasks if you live in a warmer region of the world. But yeah, at the end of the day, I will say that this is something, since it is within the pop demand and pop desires sort of system, since it is integrated and that system seems to be quite modular. You can mod in additional goods that are desired, you can mod them in at different levels, you know, whether they're luxury goods, whether they're common goods, etc, etc. I am sure that if they revisit this, they can take a look at this. This is basically where I'm coming from. I'm not saying, oh, just accept it because it could be changed. That's not where I'm coming from. Where I am coming from is that, different from my concerns for states, for example, which now have been addressed, at least largely, I don't see this as a fundamental systemic issue. I just see this as an operational issue. You can surely turn it around, but it is nonetheless, I do want to highlight that it is an absolutely valid point. I remember I made that as well in that video. At the end of the day, it's not realistic, and it would change how you play in certain regions, what you favor, what is interesting to you. But I will just basically say again that I see this as a factual, operational issue rather than a systemic issue that you couldn't rework unless you spent, you know, half a year on it. So, yeah, fair enough. Having read a lot of Paradox Dev Diaries over the years, I'm a little bit cautious. All that stuff might be in the game, rather I assume it will be because they did show it. If it feels anyway impactful remains to be seen. In the other games, those nice Dev Diaries accumulated into something like 5% this or 5% that. You never interacted with it and only knew about it, if you even cared, if you mouse over some resources and so, yes, plus 5% alloys because the faction is happy. He is in the materialist faction and is happy because I allow robots. I see. So this is in particular towards Stellaris. Now I will say, completely valid point in my point, from my point of view. This to me, I mean, the Stellaris example is quite good, I think. Stellaris goes a lot into numbers, and Stellaris, as far as I'm concerned, I played quite a bit of the latest patch, is a really good game, but you definitely get lost in the source there. You get lost in the numbers. Most of the time in Stellaris, I really do not interact with any of the factions. At most, I say, nice, I can change like one law a little bit, and then you give me more political influence, you know, that sort of thing, and that doesn't really feel impactful. I think an even better example, quite frankly, is in CK3, coded by Matthew Clohassie, great guy, had him on the channel as well. I can only recommend talking to him. He's very strong opinions, which is good. I will say that as also, if you are in game design or in game development, I really, really hope that you have strong opinions and strong visions of where you want the game to go, even if I were to disagree with you, because at the end of the day, what matters is the creativity in that job and actually implementing that creativity. And Matthew in CK3 implemented a really, really cool vassal contract renegotiation system for CK3 for feudal vassals, and that is a really, really cool system. I will stand by this. He did something there that is really outstanding when it comes to the sort of granularity that you have, what you can ask of your vassal, and so on and so forth. But realistically speaking, and I addressed that ages ago, nobody really uses it except in like some niche cases, you know, when they need to go, oh, I have a vassal here that joins a faction. If I change this slightly, my numbers don't really change, but their opinion changes and they leave the faction. It's pretty trivial in terms of how it really impacts your game, how often you interact with it, and how much you care about it. And obviously that isn't ideal. Now, in its core, that doesn't make the mechanic bad, and it certainly can happen in any game, even in an FPS and so on and so forth, but it is more noticeable in, I think, grand strategy games. So the concern of saying the standard of living is a really neat system, but at the end of the day, right, we can't say whether this actually plays out in any meaningful way, whether I will care. I think that is a more than valid concern. This is a more than valid concern for every single mechanic in these games, because that's how these mechanics are. They could look absolutely beautiful, and then you look at it and you go, I don't really care, because the impact that you have there doesn't concern me, and my state, my nation, my country can prevail. You know, it can basically ignore whether you feel good or bad about it. Now, the hope here, and this is the hope for every single grand strategy mechanic at the end of the day, is fundamentally to say, I hope it is impactful. Whether it is remains to be seen, and I just wanted to share this comment primarily because I hope I feel the same about this. Obviously, what we see in the Dev Diaries looks really good from my point of view. Again, I said that very openly a number of times for most of the mechanics that they were talking about, but I would urge you to also say, yes, it looks great, but we have to see it in action. Because at the end of the day, that's really what it's about. If it appeals in theory, that is great. Now let's hope that it really translates this appeal into the practice as well. But I will say, primarily for the standard of living, if it really was impactless, I see this primarily not as a system issue, but as an issue in the applied numbers. So that means, you know, maybe the impact of having bad standard of living should be larger, should be smaller, should be, you know, altered, should be impacted by different things. But those are not, as, you know, brought up as well earlier here, literally just a couple of minutes ago. It's not a systemic issue, it is an issue of balancing. And man, if I just think about early CK3, even it hasn't been that long, man. I mean, it's been a year, but early CK3 had definitely a number of things where I went, yeah, that's kind of broken. But that's the pleasure of playing these games. They're so complex. Something will be broken, and something, you know, will need to be fixed. I think the system is incredibly solid. If it doesn't pan out, then it needs to be adjusted, and I basically hope that they will have the time and the wherewithal, basically, to adjust it there, right? It's a big task. I will tell you this as well, as I take a sip out of my orange juice. Does it actually, I think it, like, do I have the green screen effect on? Maybe I have, don't worry about it. Yeah, that's essentially how I feel. I think we always need to consider that the team is working on a grander vision. Even if we haven't seen the entire game revealed, the way Paradox games work these days is that they attempt to integrate all of the systems that they have with one another, and that is good. In my eyes, that is incredibly good, because that makes it into a game that really feels grand. It makes it so that what you move moves other cogs in the system, and sometimes something unexpected can happen. Not something random, mind you. It will always be a result of your current actions, but something unexpected will happen, because different from chess, you know, if you're a chess grandmaster, you can see almost all moves coming. In grand strategy games, that is purposely not the case. And that also means, first of all, it's nice, but second of all, it means, yeah, it can be really difficult to balance it. So I see this angle and I approve of being cautious, but I do want to say that I do think to a certain degree you have to expect that some things will not turn out as well as you thought it would as a game designer and as a player, and sometimes they will turn out significantly better than you thought it would. Right, let's move on. I agree that the culture obsessions should be per market, because it could also imitate the slow change in cultures of people of the same culture, just further away over generations. For example, British culture and the slow change to American culture over generations of distance away from each other with less contact than if we were in the same country slowly splitting our culture groups. That is a really, really big topic. We haven't seen much. Maybe with migration we will see something there, although I'm not certain that that is a topic. Migration is the next dev diary topic, but I'm not certain that that will fit the topic. I think migration itself will be quite interesting and quite big, because they said it is more like waves compared to Victoria 2, that it has very much inherently to do with cultures and the turmoil of those cultures and so on. But we'll see about that in detail, you know, what actually happens when, for example, a South German or whatever their culture group is, I know North Italians are a thing, when a North Italian migrates to the US, how does that work? How is the sort of the push and pull of assimilation and of hybridization, so, you know, becoming American Italian or Italian American, or just becoming, you know, I mean, in Victoria 2 was a bit memey, it was like Yankee, don't worry about it, everybody became Yankees, but I don't think that is going to be the case here. How cultures behave if they move out of their homelands is something that I'm very eager to find out. I have another comment, I know this very vividly. There's another comment here addressing obsessions. I think there may even be two comments here. Let's continue this discussion of this comment and of the content of this mechanic in the upcoming comments there. This is a very, very hotly debated topic. Speed at 0.75 and you understand everything. And then on the other side, watching this at 2 times the speed is a doozy. I know that I speak very fast, I will not slow down. I have been asked this my entire time on YouTube and I understand it, I really, really understand it, but I don't feel comfortable with the idea of talking slower and then ending up with the content that already is long, so like 40 minutes per video, in this case like 2 hours, actually being 4 hours. That is just not acceptable to me on a creator, but also on a viewer level. I wouldn't want that. If you want, you can slow the videos down. I will not have a grudge against you, but I do want you to know that I watch almost all YouTube content that I do personally watch, like Northern Line, big fan of Northern Line, on 2 speed. Yeah, so that's the camp where I come from, basically. They could do something like, so here we come back to the obsessions. Obsession increases the amount of good X across a culture, regardless of country, market, or social class. Fashion increases the amount of good X for a specific social class in a specific market. And then tradition increases the amount of a good that has been in overproduction for a long time, for example 40 years, across a specific market. So I think that this will not be applicable for Victoria 3 Vanilla. I don't think this will be a factor. I think the idea here to say you can have both. It doesn't just have to be a culture that is global or a culture that is restricted to a market. You can have both in different categories, right? Obsession, fashion, and then on top of that, the tradition, where it really, for every culture, so beyond cultures, it just is true for everybody in that market. I think that is a really cool idea. I hope that they may look into that in the future. I don't know that this is, I don't think personally this is a big topic. I think Obsessions is already a big addition as it stands to the system compared to Victoria 2, but Victoria 2, again, consumption was not based on any of that. Consumption was based on what pop type you were, what pop type you could become, and what pop type you would downgrade to. So this is already a massive upgrade, and I think that is fine. We can leave it there, shelf it, right? Don't think about it too much. I will say, though, that the distinction between basically global cultural effects per market, and effects that are per market and impact everybody regardless of culture. Really, really cool idea. I like it a lot. There's one more comment. Let me just, let's go through this one. I remember reading this one. I don't remember the content at all anymore. To the devs, this is so amazing. Victoria 2 never managed to balance the pop needs properly. Even 12 years after it was released, with all the updates and DLC released, you never managed to figure out how to balance the economy, which is so weird, to be honest. The economy is really odd. I don't mean to rib on the Victoria 2 team, because I think it would be unfair, but it would also just be stupid. I'll just say it. Listen, whenever we do these Dev Diary videos, I am the first that says Victoria 2 did this really poorly. But I want to point out, much like I did it when we did the CK3 pre-release Dev Diaries, whenever I criticized Crusader Kings 2, I wasn't doing that as in, what a shoddy development team, terrible. No, what I was saying was, for the time, that was the best we've ever seen. right? But since then, we've moved on to new systems, new tech, if you will, has developed, and I feel similarly here. It's not confusing that they didn't, like, get the balancing right, that the pops were, like, pretty 2D to a degree. That was the creme de la creme. That was the cherry on top. It was massive, right? So I get the angle, of course, to saying it is kind of weird, but also, like, man, different times, right? Really smaller teams, different times. First time this sort of extensive thing has been tried. Victoria Revolutions Ricky never tried it to this degree at all. So yeah, Victoria 2 obviously unbalanced and many things where I'm like, yeah, that's not that good. But man, what a pioneer in its field. Now let's continue. A connection between the pop's need and growth plus rebellions was always meant to be in Victoria 2 based on what I can see in the game files. However, you never managed to balance Victoria 2 properly to make this work. Some of the most popular mods in Victoria 2, HFM and HPM, completely neglected this feature since they had little understanding of how Victoria 2's economy was meant to work, and resulted in all pops getting no needs for the entirety of the game. HPM and HFM, I want to say, are amazing, outstanding mods. They do great work in large parts of it, but I will say, yes, absolutely, the genuine society building of those mods didn't go any further than in Victoria 2's vanilla game. The immersion, the flair, the feeling of it, yes, certainly, went further, much, much further. But I think the economy, basically, and the how pops interact with it, stagnated because of just how the system was. That's just how it is at the end of the day. The reason why it is so weird that the devs and even the major mod creators never managed to balance the Victoria 2 economy is it took myself under 8 hours to figure out how to balance. Well, okay. If it was that easy, I think we would have a lot more competition for Victoria 2, right? The issue was mix of over and under production of some goods, artisans being too weak in terms of production, and too many farmers being unemployed due to province caps on available jobs for farmers. See, that is an issue. I don't disagree, and let's just disregard like whether the system is truly fixed. Listen, it's easy to say, it's hard to actually do, but the thing about it is that ultimately was what this boils down to. If we look at it from a game design point of view, and in particular from a grand strategy point of view, and it is interesting to bring up, this is why the comment is actually in here now, I recall, or why I thought it should be in here. Game design needs to be circling around robust systems. This is true for FPS games, for real-time strategy games, for turn-based games. You need systems that don't break at the flick of a wrist. You need something that works in 90% of cases. And Victoria 2 was a very specialized, was a very specific, and was such a, like, in the moment, sort of, just approaching the general problems the game designers at the time were aware, the modders were aware at the time, right? It is so specific that it wasn't a robust system. It could break, you know, if, for example, in Burma, somebody was too rich. The entire stockpile of goods, the entire stockpile of the monetary supply could get stuck somewhere and the system could break. That is way less robust than what we've seen from Victoria 3, which is why I brought this comment in here. It is very important for me to point out that this change that Victoria 3 is doing is not just more workable and more accurate, it is also more robust, and that is a primary objective of modern day games, and in particular modern day grand strategy games, because if you have so many cogs that are, you know, sort of stuck together, you can't have one of them break. It will suck. It will really suck. So this is a massive change that has been made there. So either the devs as creative as this, if they were making Vic 2, has no understanding of basic, no, again, bit harsh. Listen, I get it. Sometimes we're harsh in comments, but yeah, no effort was put in the issue. No, okay. This was my biggest fear with Victoria 3, that you would make the same mistakes as Victoria 2 and never put the tiny effort into fixing the pop standard of living issues we saw in Victoria 2. And it really makes me happy that you actually have this major issue on your mind. Great job, guys. So, again, I think the comment is far too harsh and takes it far too easy to solve it, but the core issue for me is, of course, yes, Victoria 3, much more robust in its systems, and that is very important. This is why I'm so positive towards Victoria 3 and towards what we have seen, because they have systems that in their very basic level are incredibly robust, and that is vital for building up on it, both from modders but also from the game design point of view. Let me change the mic again, and let's move on. I agree that it's such an important change to disconnect the pop type, or what is now called profession, from their wealth and consumption. It adds so much more realism and also flexibility into your options for managing the economy. Agreed. The only fact that I can see missing from all of this is economy of scale. Often as the supply increases, even if demand increases equally, it still makes something cheaper to produce. That is true. And let me think about it. I think this should be accounted for if we think about production methods, because production methods in a way simulate, or well, emulate the economy of scale. They enter and say, we can now produce significantly more, it will be cheaper, and that will make it so that more people will have access to the good, meaning that the standard of living in generally should rise, even if more people at the same time demand the good. If you genuinely, if you had a, if you had an equal increase, it depends on what you mean here. You're completely correct, and I think this is modeled via the production methods. If you have a more efficient production method, the economy of scale kicks in there just the same, because it's the same principle. If you produce something cheap, it comes out cheap, you can produce more, right? Basically, the idea that I see here is that if we mean, or if we if we interpret the term equal, so an equal increase of demand to mean proportionally, so because it needs to go up in the same, you know, like what do you even call this curve? See, math has been far removed from my life. But sorry, I actually had to look that up. I was like, in my mind, I was like, I can't come up with the term, or remember the term. And what I'm talking about is if we interpret equal to mean an equally exponential increase, right? Because like the economy of scale is exponential. That's the idea of it. It doesn't go like linear, it's an exponential curve. And if we apply that for the term equal here, that equal means that it's an equally exponential increase, then that actually won't really make it cheap. It will make it cheaper to produce, of course, but the end result is that you get into an equilibrium there. But yeah, no, it is true. If we interpret equal as something that says, yeah, it increases in a similar, in a steady, in a large level, then that necessarily doesn't mean that, you know, or that doesn't necessarily mean that the price remains the same. No, it will indeed decrease, but I think that is modeled via the, technique here with the production methods. I will say, of course, if you overproduce, that is generally bad. Yes, it makes it cheaper, but it also makes the industries less interesting, or rather less attractive, both for investors and both for the workers, because of course the workers will be paid less since, hey, just around the corner there's 15 more of these manufacturers, of these factories that do this stuff, and at the same time you don't make as much money as a capitalist, so of course you're not very interested in that. Now, I will say, I think this is accounted for, I think this will be done, but it has to be something we need to keep in mind. This, yet again, goes back to the operational issue, to the issue of, yes, the system should account for this. Whether it does, we will have to see. But I will tell you, I'm going to tell you right now, there is a little-known fact. There is Paul Depré, who is the QA lead for Victoria 3, and he has actually a degree in historical economics, or history of economics, in economics. So I am positive that they can figure that out, because I'm sure that also not he is probably the only expert on that topic. But yeah, no, I'm sure that they have that on the radar, the topic of basically saying, how do we work with the economy of scale? Now, I agree, as a game rule, I think that would be most interesting. This is on the topic of historical loans and debt situations going on. And I said back then that I would like it as a game rule, that you could essentially say, okay, we have this thing where we say, you know, basically, we want, I don't know, I think Haiti has very, very large loans, I believe, to France at the start of the game. You have other nations, of course, that are deeply in debt. Of course, when we look at the Napoleonic Wars, how the Napoleonic Wars and how that went. And I think that, of course, is in the vanilla rules isn't modeled, and I think that is fine, because ultimately it is a pain to balance, I'm absolutely certain. But I do think, if it was a game rule, if you say, okay, we can account for this, we can say this is in the game, but you need to turn it on, I think that could please basically everybody. So let's read the comment further. Personally, I think there should be 3 options: no debts at game start, AI debts at game start, and realistic, with the first option not giving any country debts at game start, the second not giving whichever country the player picks debts at the start, but AI-led countries to get them, and then finally an option where everyone gets them to according to the country they choose, including the player. Option 2 should obviously disable Iron Man mode, since it leaves the AI behind, but might still be interesting if you don't like starting in debt, because you don't find it fun, but you do want a world that is as realistic as possible outside of that. But nothing against it. I think it's a cool idea. I wonder just how much control will we have over the costs of the things our pops will need for their living standards. Could I, for example, make transportation free for everyone so that they don't need to spend money on that, thus they have more money to spend on other things? I don't see what would speak against that. I mean, you could model this in different ways. And so, like, this will sound stupid, right? But it really isn't. It's very interchangeable. It's very flexible when it comes to budgeting of on a household level, on a micro level. You could not have the option to make transport free, but you could look at, hey, how much do people pay on average for transport? And then just say, I'm gonna reduce taxes, I'm gonna, reduce whatever else we have, I'm gonna maybe subsidize some other industries. So in a way, indirectly, you are subsidizing the industry that is train traffic, that is, transport, and then they wouldn't have to pay for it. They are paying for it, but they're getting the money back in other sources. That is possible, that is definitely viable. You could also, and I would assume that they do that, you could also just make it generally free. So, like, everybody can use it. I don't see why that wouldn't be possible, because we have subsidies. So, transport, if I don't misremember this, is actually exclusively run by you, but you can, for regular business, of course, you can say, I do subsidies, to a certain level until it gets competitive, and I wouldn't see why that wouldn't be possible. I mean, honestly, It might not be, but I think that this should be something that could be made possible for sure. And yeah, you should have a way of basically influencing this. I mean, transport is one of the primary topics for everything in the modern world, both today, of course, but also, in 1836 until 1936. Could I get myself in a situation where my economy is doing so well that I could make things like electricity and food free so that every pop strata becomes opulent? I think to have everyone be opulent, you need to be like... You need to have tech from like Stellaris. That would be crazy. But I do think if you're doing incredibly well, I mean, it also comes down to economic theory, of course. If you're doing incredibly well, you're supposed to actually just save money. I mean, in this Keynesian idea. And then during the crisis, you would be spending money. But I don't see why, if you can't afford it, why you wouldn't do it. I mean, in general, this has always been a thing, of course, where certain primary needs... Well, it hasn't always been a thing, but it has then regularly been a thing, and in many, many places in the world, it is today a thing, where people say, we guarantee a certain thing. You get a certain thing. In Germany, listen, you can still be homeless. Don't let me say there isn't a homeless plight. These things are still going on, but where I'm coming from is, everyone is guaranteed an apartment. That doesn't mean everyone actually gets one. I'm talking about a legal institution. There will always be people that fall through the net. It is a thing of reality, of statistics. Listen, statistically speaking, with how many views I get on the channel, there will always be idiots in them. Maybe you are one of them. No, listen, I'm kidding. Where I'm coming from, statistically speaking, it will never be fully eliminated, but the state says, yeah, everybody gets it. In Bismarck times, in the times of Bismarck, when he tried to sort of push back against the SPD, so against the Social Democratic and the Communist and the Socialist movements, he was essentially saying, yeah, look, I want them to leave, and that is why I'm going to guarantee basic health, basic pension, insurance, and so on and so forth, right? So I don't see why that wouldn't be a case here. I don't know how directly you can subsidize goods to that massive degree where it is actually just straight up like that, because what we're talking about here primarily, I think, fits the topic of institutions, education, pensions, insurances, and so on and so forth. But I think you can have this effect even if you can't directly do electricity, right? But I do think the effect can be absolutely valid. And potentially viable. Perhaps the level of control should be available for more authoritarian totalitarian states, or maybe it could also be available to socialist democracies as well. I think it would be interesting if we could have such power over the prices of such things so that we could try to make a utopia, or perhaps even fail at doing that and instead crash our national economy harder than the Great Depression. Really cool thought. I really, really like this. How in depth that goes, I can't say. But I will say, primarily when it comes to authoritarian regimes, what we have to keep in mind, I want to remind everybody here, because it's been a while since that happened. The equivalent to Victoria II's national focuses today still exists, and you can do that with authority, so there's the authority point, and if you are, the more authoritarian you are, the more you can actually do that, right? So you could, I mean, you already have some focuses, basically, for example, making transport easier, bringing infrastructure up, I believe was the benefit back in the day. I'm gonna look that up when I cut the video. But basically, to a degree, you already have that for authoritarian regimes, but for that, we also aren't well informed enough yet about the question of where are we standing on the topic of authority versus institutions. How do they compare? Which one? How do they play out? Where will you be on average? Whether you're totalitarian, whether you're a democracy, whether you're a monarchy. That remains to be seen, operational stuff, but yeah, no, I really, listen, many basic goods are basically guaranteed in many states of the world. Whether that actually works, right, whether there's some bureaucratic issue, whether you can't get everybody in the net, that's a different topic. I mean, just in general, I think it would be realistic, and I think to a degree with the subsidies and whatnot, we already are seeing this. How much that actually will be played out, honestly, let's wait until we see genuine gameplay. I don't think it is necessary for release, but controlling state taxes would be amazing. This is such an interesting topic. We talked about this for a while now. I think in the last 2 months or so. Imagine solving pop density issues by granting tax incentives on less populated states. This would add another layer of micromanaging and make a great expansion, being able to create law exceptions of any kind in any state and seeing the pops reacting to that. Imagine using a single state as an experiment for a law, and then if it generates the intended result, just apply it for the whole nation, and if not, having to deal with local poverty by other state laws. We have this in real life. I want to say this, because this is true. This is just a factor. Now, currently it is not a thing. States are administrative regions rather than truly independent. Let's say in the US, of course, it is a big topic right there. What is a state's right when it comes to legislation? What is a a federal right, but that is also a topic in, for example, modern day Germany. It's even a topic frankly, in Spain, in Italy, and so on and so forth. In the UK, surely as well, when we look at the different policies of the councils there, although the councils, of course, have significantly less power than, states, for example, in Germany, whereas you have the devolved parliaments in Scotland and in Wales. I think Wales has... No? Does Wales have one? I think Wales has one, right? Yeah. The Senate. The Senate. I'm pretty sure they call it the Senate, with a double D, if I'm not mistaken. So this is, of course, a real-life phenomenon. But as you mentioned, and this has to be brought up, it brings in a lot of micromanagement, and that is not per se bad. But when we bring in micromanagement, we have to ask, is it worth the features that we gain? And about that, I'm not actually certain. So this is a super interesting topic. I'm super intrigued by it, and I'm very happy that we are discussing it. But when I think about the benefits, yes, of course, you could play around in certain states, but I do think the reality is that only certain aspects should be granular to get an impactful, genuine gameplay. And I think that is already in. Now, where am I coming from here? I'm basically coming from the idea, and this is abstracted. Don't get this wrong here. This is not exactly what you're asking for. But if I have in a state a certain industry, and I say I want that industry to do better in that state so that the attraction of migration as a so this state is a target of migration, that this attraction goes up, that is a topic where I'm saying subsidize the industry. If you subsidize the industry, you can make it more attractive and bring it to a point where you can say, hey, look at this. We just made it so this state is as though we gave them tax breaks. You still, even if you subsidize them, you still get payouts from their taxes and whatnot, but less, right? So it isn't the exact mechanic as saying we have a very specific state law here that applies to the state, but you can already basically go in and say, in this state, I'm going to subsidize this industry. So I get the thought. I think it's a really cool thought, but we already have a certain micro level that does the same thing, even if it comes from a different vector. I want to point that out. It comes from a different direction, right? Your angle is basically saying, I want to uppity this, I want to make it so that it's all state-based, and that is cool, that is a cool idea, and this is the result, right? This is what you want to reach. You want to reach it from here. The system that we have can already reach this, albeit from a different angle. It's abstracted, and abstraction can be bad, can be good, but I think in this case, as long as it does its job, I don't necessarily see the benefit of doing more micromanagement that does the same result, because in both cases, you basically make less money. Right? In one case, you spend money and then get money back, but the net benefit that you get out of that industry is less. And on the other hand, if you just say less taxes, you also get less money. And in both cases, the result is this state is more attractive for investors, is more attractive for workers, and so on. Right? So that's basically where I'm coming from. I think it's cool, a cool idea, but I don't think the micro has the benefits that warrant bringing more micro into the game. Cultural obsessions should be global. Something who doesn't partake in their cultural practices is obviously no longer... Right, this was a... Don't take this comment too seriously in, like, its examples. Is obviously no longer part of that culture and has assimilated. British people in South Africa didn't just stop drinking tea. Italians in America didn't just stop eating pasta. And Turks in Germany didn't stop smoking hashish. I don't think marijuana is obviously, there's, like, let's say... Shisha, right? Shisha is, of course, very common, was definitely a cultural thing, has spread since then. But I think this is a... You're not wrong, but it doesn't really answer the question of what happens to a culture if they lived in a different country, in a different society for 50 years, right? Because, like, there is definitely assimilation, but also hybridization going on. And at some point, listen, I know this breaks the heart of some, and I'm, Italian Americans obviously have heritage and whatnot, but they're not Italians. If I live in, let's say, Japan, and then I have a child there, and that child marries there, and that child, has another child. The child of my child, of course, has German heritage, but they're not Germans, right? So, obviously, I don't disagree for as long as you migrate, and as long as this is an immediate factor, an immediate aftermath, basically, of you migrating and then saying, I am still who I am, my generation is still here, this is who we are. I get it, yes, the obsession should transfer from your home country to where you live now, and your new home country, basically, right? But where I'm coming from is fundamentally the idea that at some point we have to talk about a diversion there, right? And what that looks like, I'm very curious. We don't know much about it. So for a moment, I agree, cultural obsessions should be global, but at the same time, at some point, you're no longer the same culture. And how that plays out, how those obsessions play out, I'm not sure. I believe there's one more obsession comment in here. And if not, then there's a big point that I want to make there. So let's just see whether we get there. Also, this dev diary really highlights how cool cheaper consumption of locally produced goods would be. Instead of all pops in the country eating the same proportion of goods, you really would have the coastal pops eating fish and in the inland pops eating grain. This would reach a steady state where if there were some grain blight events, all food prices would go up, of course, but the inland pops would be losing the relatively cheaper grain access they had and would be hit harder. This is true if you don't have 100% market access, just as a clarification. This could lead to interesting scenarios where famine is more localized and not only are poor hit harder than rich, but inland are hit harder than coastal, or perhaps whale overhunting leads to fishing communities facing higher heating costs, while those in the wooded areas fare a bit better. I think this will be simulated or emulated to a degree. I don't think as thoroughly as this hopes for, which would be very cool. But basically, I remember them saying that at a part in their development, most of your states were never at 100% market access, in which case you would have this exact thing. It can still happen as it is, even with 100% market access, right? If you have, for example, obsessions, or if you just have something that is very conveniently in your vicinity, but it would be more pronounced. Also, it would be more pronounced for regional famines if you had a position where you running out of grain really overfuses your infrastructure usage. I don't think it will be this pronounced in the game, but it will be there to a degree, at least from how I understand it. I think the global cultural obsessions make sense because I see them as a part of what a culture is. Oh, this is the comment where I was like, don't take the obsessions too seriously. Obviously, you know, everybody has inclinations, but we don't need to go too far. An American in Germany still craves fast food. Interesting example, because that's just who we are. The issue I would be unhappy with is somehow Irish migrants in America spawning an obsession in the native population of Ireland. Yeah, good point. We haven't seen much on culture yet, but I think this could be handled pretty well by having cultural enclaves separated by, say, continents, form divergent cultures. Agreed. Like in CK3. Like Irish American when population acceptance, some other factors reaches a threshold. No, I agree. First of all, the fast food, I would say a better example, and this is also because Germany definitely also has entered that culture to a degree, but I think something that I would be thinking of would, for example, and it doesn't fit Victoria, but I would be thinking of, for example, SUVs. There are more and more SUVs on German streets as well, but they are not nearly as common as they are in the United States of America. And that also means that their prices are fairly high in comparison to the USA. Meaning that if you have an obsession there, if we want to call that an obsession, right? Yeah, of course, that would translate, and at a certain degree, as you say, there would be, I think I said diversion? I didn't mean that earlier, I mean divergent. The divergent cultures is a really good idea. We haven't seen much on that. I am very, very eager to find out how migration plays into, hybridization, into assimilation, and into diverging. Very, very interested. I do want to go back. I think this is, you're correct. Yeah, global obsessions are fine if we have this system. I still really, really like the idea earlier with the tradition, fashion, and obsession. But yeah, no, I think this is a great point as well. I get why you love taboos and obsessions and professions, but the standard of living and wealth level is what I love the most about this. It's such an improvement over Victoria 2. No longer will landowners just randomly turn into clerks because they couldn't afford wine. No longer are rebels a given. It's just such a big improvement and I love it. Yeah, I'll be real with you. I think I've seen some comments, and I'm not sure they were even under this video. I think they were in the later videos maybe. Maybe we have some in the mix here, I'm not sure. But I've seen some comments, and I mean, I get it. Listen, everybody is entitled to their opinion, of course, that essentially said that they don't think there's a big difference between pop types and the profession and standard of living corporation. Oh, it must have been in the profession dev diary, right. I could not disagree more. I could not disagree more with that point of view. Because when we have professions and how they are created by saying, if it pays more, I'm going to switch. If I'm losing my job, then I'm going to take whatever I can, as long as it pays me quite well, whatever my best opportunity is. That is so much better, because now no longer are people defined by their jobs. Of course, yes, what they can do, that defines them, right? What qualifications they have. But ultimately, they are defined by their income. You can have an incredibly, incredibly wealthy person. If they can't fulfill their needs, it doesn't really matter to them. They will become unhappy, but they won't stop being landowners. It's much less arcadey, it's much less fitting. Huge fan. I think this is a massive improvement over Victoria 2, but I stated that so often in previous videos, and we have made the circle. So, let's talk about obsessions, right? Is there something I want to say there? Oh yeah, I'm not even kidding. I actually had to think about this for ages. Because, like, I had this point early in my mind and then I forgot about it. This teaches me to record 40 minutes for one dev diary, community feedback. But I wanted to talk about obsessions and cultures. Because no matter how it plays out, what happens to a culture that migrates, how assimilation, hybridization, and divergence play out, I thought about the questions of how many cultures do we have. The cultures that we've seen to date, except for Austrian, which is new, were pretty much spot on the cultures that we have in Victoria too. If you look at the cultures right here, cultures of the same heritage, which is South Asian heritage, 19. That is the exact same number as in Victoria too. Now, initially, my reaction was, that kind of sucks. I mean, in India, honestly, I'm not an Indian culture expert at all, so, like, I don't know whether this is too many, too few, just right. But, obviously, North Italian and South Italian are much, much more diverse, and that I know, right? I know the difference goes even much further, not just culture, but it also goes into language and whatnot, you know? I believe the Tuscan, maybe even just the Florentine, but the Tuscan is what is modern-day standard Italian. And if you look, for example, at Naples, if you look at Sicilian, those languages, which they're not just accents or dialects, those languages are wildly different. So they are definitely different, even from one another, of course, but in particular from those differences. I thought about this, and I said to myself, more cultures would be cool, immersion, yada yada. But then I thought about it, and I will tell you, there's a huge drawback. If you have, let's say, 10 cultures, I don't know how many you would have, but let's say 10 cultures in Italy, if you would have, let's say, 6, 7, 8, 9 cultures in Germany. And the issue with that is, let's say you are the Prussians. Prussia has, let's say, currently it's just North German. I don't know. Let's assume it's just North German. If North German develops an obsession, that is a major event for you. That is something you genuinely care about. That is something where you say, I need to address this. I need to either go against it, I need to go with it, I can make them happy, I can try to, expand into luxury furniture or whatever the hell you have, and it will matter. If you have, let's say, 5 cultures within Prussia, and one develops an obsession, you might be like, don't really care that much. Doesn't really impact me that much. If I import what you need, it's not going to change my market all that much. I don't really care, right? You might care, but it gets significantly worse if you imagine the same scenario, but in the United States of America. If you are the USA and you get migrants from 7, 8, 9, 10 different subculture groups of German and 7, 8, 9, 10 different subculture groups of Italian, you don't care about any of those obsessions. It's a huge issue to me. It's a massive, massive issue. I'm not saying it shouldn't be done. I'm just saying I think that them not splitting cultures more than what we have seen so far. Again, this is literally Victoria 2 right here. We have seen North Italian, which makes me assume there's South Italian, which means maybe there's 2 or 3 cultures as a total, depending on whether you have like Central Italian, right, in there. So like in Victoria 2 there was 2 for Italian, we had North and South, and in Victoria 3 it's 2, maybe it's 3, I don't know, maybe Central is in there as well. And I will say, originally, my real reaction was, maybe that's not enough. But now that I think about it, these taboo, these obsession mechanics, the turmoil, what their homelands are, how they assimilate, how they work, all of that, sincerely, won't matter if you splinter it too much. On a gameplay level. If you are the US and you have literally 50 cultures, because that's how many there are, if we splinter this all the way down, you won't care for any of their obsessions, and that is a huge detrimental effect in gameplay. So, all that I wanted to, without the comments, wanted to bring in on the topic of obsessions, and we don't know much about cultures yet. I currently, unless they found a solution, which they may have, I currently tend to say, maybe we shouldn't split cultures too much. I would like to see mods with it, but I think for this core vanilla system of obsession and taboos, you just won't care if you splinter it up too much. And that concludes the Dev Diary number 13 feedback community feedback. If you want to respond to anything that I have said or to anything that the comments have said, please go ahead and do a timestamp when you call upon me, when you leave a comment. And then I can like actually know what is going on, what you're referring to, right? Because this is going to be a long ass video. Now we're going to move on to Dev Diary number 13. See you there. Alright folks, and this brings us to Dev Diary number 14, political movements. This was a really neat one because it really approached, you know, hey, how do you enact a law? What happens? How do the interest groups stand to it? How do the pops stand to it? And we have a mix there. The interest groups will support it, and then the pops will support any of those political movements as well if they feel that they are adequate. We have movements to preserve a law. This is triggered basically if you are trying to get rid of something, for example the monarchy, then they will get active in a political movement for as long as you're trying to get rid of it. Movement to enact means, yeah, you don't have a law, they want a law and they want you to push it. And then movement to restore would be something that basically says we want this back. If you manage to get the monarchy out of Great Britain, there may be a movement to restore right after. If you, for example, made alcohol illegal, there may be a movement against that in terms of the prohibition. Really, really cool system. I was a huge fan of this, the way that they approached this. I think that this adds a lot that you can influence, both because your population is directly involved and you have a certain degree of power. For example, such as political movements will never be joined by people that are in your government, so by interest groups that are in your government, making it very interesting when we talk about government formation, which frankly in Victoria 2 was not interesting, because all you really considered was, can I change my government? And if so, can I change my government away from laissez-faire and anti-war? Now that is different now, it is much more complex, there's much more to it, and we should check out the feedback from the comments right now. Reverting laws can't be that common in history. I mean, we had prohibition in the United States. It's from the time period, and it's pretty major. And many laws are stripped from the books as time goes on. They just tend to be minor, outdated, and forgotten about. Just because it is one of the three kinds of movements, it doesn't mean to represent a third. The vast majority of political movements will be to liberalize. Yes. So, fundamentally, yes, this is true. I actually think, so when it comes to reverting laws, right? I think that this is more to show that less to be like, this needs now to be successful, right? So, obviously, yeah, there won't be that many people that join in on, you know, for example, saying we want a completely censored press or no press back, right? That won't happen. But there will be people in that. And that is important, right? This is really, really important. Even if they fail, even if they have no chance to succeed, we are looking at a political movement where you can track how radicalized people are, how angry people are, and who is radicalized and angry. Which interest group goes against you? Which pops are going against you? Whether it is the landowners, for example, whether it is the working class. They may not be successful in wanting something reactionary, much of the time, but it definitely is something that allows you to very easily keep track of how difficult and how dissenting a certain fraction of your population is. In this case, the more conservative and or reactionary leaning people. Although that is, of course, I do want to push that. That is not always true. Let's say, for example, you are a republic and you institute a new law that you become a monarchy. There could be people that say, I want to revert. I want to become a republic again. Right? So that technically, you're not a conservative or a reactionary, although we are... Listen, definition, semantics, okay? No, what I'm talking about is, we're looking at a situation where you definitely... Even if it's not successful, even if for the majority it's not supposed to be successful, you're looking at something that helps you keep track of the actual feelings of a certain subgroup of the society and of the population. And we live in a society, so I think that is pretty cool. What they're doing there is a really, really neat increase of both interacting with them, so the interactivity there is much, much larger, and the actual potential for you to be, okay, I understand what my society thinks in all of its facets, not just in the facet that says we need to move forward, but also the facet that says we need to go back. Very, very interesting. I'm a big fan. Obviously, they wouldn't be that common, or rather, they wouldn't be very common to succeed, but I will tell you, if you get rid of, you know, the monarchy, if you get rid of, I don't know, rights. You know, if you get rid of restrictions to the press, for example, there will be people against that, and keeping track of them is what matters, so that you understand your society as you play. If you play Victoria 3 or Victoria 2, or Victoria 1 for that purpose, and don't understand where your society is currently at in its headspace, the game sort of sucks. You know what I mean? Like, you need that. And I think this is a powerful tool to make the player aware of what certain sub-areas of society want. 1 day ago, artisans in Bavaria can no longer afford 7 units of Hefeweizen a week, and 0 days ago, political movement, German reactionaries created. I have said this, and this is not a political judgment. It's not a value judgment, it's just a realistic judgment, in my opinion. If you were to raise the price, not even make it illegal, if you were to raise the price of beer in Germany, you would get voted out. So this is a real life example, actually. There's a funny video, there's a really good video. I believe it's like from 1950 on YouTube, where in Austria, the government raised the price for beer. And everybody was like, it's a basic food item, foodstuffs for us workers. Very funny, very good. So these sort of movements would definitely form, yeah, absolutely. When it comes to simulate aging and people dying off, etc., I think the only way to simulate it properly would be if each single individual were an object. Perhaps in 20 years we'll have PCs powerful enough to do that. So obviously this comment doesn't expect this, but I do want to clarify this as well, which is why this is in here. Very obviously, when they speak about aging, you will never be like, oh, Tom and his friend Max died, and that means the old generation is gone, and that means the literacy drops by 5%. No, basically, it's a gradual process, right? So it would be really cool if every pop was literally simulated. Won't happen. It's impossible. It's physically impossible with the current technology, maybe even with the future technology. But probably not with the future technology, though. I do want to retire in a VR retirement home. Anyway, where I'm coming from is this idea that basically it is indeed correct, and you shouldn't make yourself any illusions that when they say they're doing aging, what they very likely mean is that, and I detailed that in the video already, but I want to reiterate that because I don't want anybody to have any wrong expectations. If you have a 50% literacy rate, because this was possible until now, but then your expectation, because, I don't know, you take away the education institution, you make it weaker, that sort of stuff, goes down to 30, it's not gonna, for that pop, go down from 50 to 30. But like in 20 years, so one generation roughly, it'll gonna drift towards 30. This is what they mean from aging, dying off, qualifications being lost because of generational changes. This is this thing. At least as I understand it. I want to make that clear. Obviously, I haven't played the game either. I haven't even seen it except for the public screenshots. But basically, that is how I see it. And that I do think, with the current technological level, is the only way this can be depicted. So yeah, just to clarify that again, where I think we are standing on that. Alright, so I have several things to say about this dev diary. 8:35, so this was a timestamp. I absolutely love this because this is so open for political maneuver. If you can get a bothersome interest group, so this is about an interest group not being able to join a political movement if they are in your government. If you can get them into the government, you can essentially temporarily nullify this part of it, probably with some downsides, like that interest group really hating you if you then do nothing that they like. But that's good. Trade-offs are good. I agree. I cannot tell you how much I love all of this. No, seriously, I cannot tell you how much I love all of this. I love that you can side with the political elite or the power of the people, and both are viable options. Either the few who have much or the many who have little, but both equally valid ways to gain power. I will say, obviously this is true, but you should not expect a genuine sandbox. You can't get rid of the monarchy in the first 10 years in the UK, in Great Britain. It doesn't work. Would be neat, would be funny, but many people will be angry and widely regard this as a bad move. But yes, you absolutely can either go, I want to stay authoritarian, I want to stay on this, or I want to liberalize, I want to maybe at some point get rid of the monarchy. Very viable options, although there is more tactile movements required for one compared to the other. I love that you can draw interest groups away from movements by pleasing them through alternative means. Sounds like that's going to be very flexible. It actually reminds me of a classic, well, not really a story, but the classic circumstances of the Kaiserreich. Between, of course, 1871 and 1914, but primarily around the time that Bismarck was the Reichskanzler, and even before the Kaiserreich, of course, with the North German Federation and Prussia, because what he did, and this is something that I think most people that went to school in Germany will know. I know this is like very necessary, student material, very obviously, because it is like fairly close history. If you think about it, we are, barely over 100 years away from the Kaiserreich no longer existing, and technically still, whatever. Technically, the Federal Republic of Germany, legally speaking, is the same legal entity as the Kaiserreich, and to some degree also the North German Federation of 1866, but not that matters right now, just here's a little tidbit. What Bismarck did, Bismarck was not a liberal to any degree. Bismarck was very much a conservative. He was against democracy, he was against parliament, he was against that power, he was very much in favor of the Kaiser, and before that the König, doing what must be done. And the way he did this, the way he dealt with parliamentary democracy being a part of life in Prussia, in the North German Federation, and in the Kaiserreich, was by constantly switching alliances. By constantly going, today I'm going to please this and that, be it the liberals, be it the national conservatives, and so on and so forth, and then I'm going to throw you away if I don't need you anymore. He was not like basically constantly switching, but rather he had shifting alliances because all he wanted was pragmatism. All he wanted was that he can Be there with the Kaiser, with the authority that the Kaiser brings, and maintain that. That was in his interest. Not democracy, not genuine ideology. Well, his ideology was, of course, monarchism, right? But this idea, his idea, was very much exactly what is described here. And that is really, really cool. This can be done now. Very, very, very cool. Where you could, say at some point, yeah, the industrialists, you may join us always, because, yeah, we love that. But sometimes we're gonna have the intelligentsia, other times we're gonna have the military, other times we're gonna have the, I don't know, whatever else there is, right? Maybe even sometimes the workers. Hey, I mean, let's be real here. He kept the SPD, he kept the KPD, so the communists, the socialists, and the social democrats, he kept them down by basically saying, hey, check it out. Honestly, now that I think about it, I'm not sure if the KPD existed during Bismarck's period. I think it was just the SPD. But either way, where I'm coming from is that you can do that now. You can please them as you see fit in the moment. Really, really cool strength of this system. Passing a law takes time in this game. Can that time period be related to the type of government? Dictators can change fast, but the opposition having high militancy, while republics have slow change and opposition having low militancy? Honestly, I don't know. I think actually, let's think about this. Currently, what we know is what it depends on how fast you can pass a law is on how powerful the interest groups that support you are. The more powerful they are, the easier. Don't need to be any debates. You don't need to persuade anybody. You don't need to flex your muscles in parliament to get the majority. You just have the majority. Even if you don't have a parliament, of course, that's how it works, right? Even if you don't have parliamentary debates, you still have interest groups that influence how fast you can do something. If you're a dictatorship and you directly suppress interest groups that don't support you, they would have high militancy. Well, they would high radicalization. That's what it's called in Victoria 3. And the change would be fast, yeah. I don't see why it wouldn't be possible. I think this exact thing is the case. Yes. Very cool thought. Please tell me they reworked the rebel system. That was a major headache in Victoria 2. It's time for a daily socialist revolution. Yes, honey. Oh, and I didn't even censor the name there. I gotta do that in editing. Anyway, yeah. No, rebels in Victoria 2 suck. Anybody that tells you differently has a bad opinion. Let me be a radical once, in my opinion, okay? We don't know how rebellions and revolutions and civil wars will look like at this point, but it can't be worse than Victoria 2. So let's hope that the political movements translate into that. I wonder if you will be able to exert influence in other countries as well. Say I play as the Netherlands and have recently managed to get Denmark hooked on the opium I grow in Indonesia. My government would try its damnedest to keep opium legal in Denmark, whether it be through diplomatic channels, bribes, or economic sanctions. I think it might be possible. So we know that you can, for example, but that is very special and very specific, so it might not apply, but I do want to mention it. You can, for example, have anti-slavery wars. That is something that does work, so that changes directly a policy that they have in a different country. You can enter the market of somebody else via treaty ports, and you surely, if you are influential, and they did mention that an overlord of a country has a political influence on that country, but they haven't gone into depth with it. So my instinct says probably. Very likely. What that actually looks like, we don't know. But cool idea, keep it in mind, please do it. I want to see a Denmark hooked on opium, and then see how they perform in winter sports, the Winter Olympics. No, very cool thought. I think should be viable, yeah, absolutely. I just hope it's not too easy. It's good that there are many different and somewhat contradictory choices in how to run your country, but if it's pure sandbox, where everything is feasible, or I'll play the absolute dictator Tsar, but I'll make everyone so happy with these few policies that it's fine with all of them, that devalues the choices you make. I agree. It's actually true. If it's too easy, of course, that is what it devolves into. I want it to be actually possible to, well, just fail. I want this enlightened government, but everyone's pissed at me, and now my monarchy is dead and the country is burning. Should be an outcome that happens, and probably even one that is not too unlikely. So, I don't share your concern. Well, on a basic level, obviously I share the concern that it might be too easy. I don't think that this applies yet. I don't have that feeling about Victoria 3 so far, but of course, that is a basic concern that should be on everybody's radar. But I will say, I don't have that concern for Victoria 3 in particular, because it is genuinely viable to fail and just continue playing. In other games, not viable. Hearts of Iron 4, not viable. EU4, not really viable, yes, to a degree, but like, if you are in a disaster in EU4, it's bad. It's just bad, right? In Victoria 2, hey, if rebels rise up and you say, yeah, I like those rebels, I want those guys, you can just lose, right? So I think it probably will follow the footsteps there of Victoria 2. I share the concern in theory, but in practice, I so far do not have the impression that it's too easy, but I agree with the idea it shouldn't be too easy, because, hey, failing is cool. Failing is such a great story. I wish CK3 pushed failing and failure, if you roleplay, more, and made that more attractive, because the best stories ever written are when you lose half of your family to a war that you weren't able to win. They are dead, they were killed, you know, in the siege, and then you take revenge. That sort of stuff is the stuff of true stories. So I agree. The more failure is encouraged and the more failure is fun, the better it is. So I do hope that it's difficult, and that failure isn't just, well, you got screwed over. No, it's more like you're in a different position now. Consider your options. I would like that a lot. I'm interested in how combat would look and how revolutions are fought. We don't know. I don't think we're gonna know anytime soon. And we're back. So this is the end of the 14th political movement dev diary. Pretty cool dev diary. Let's move on to number 15. I will see you on the other side. So here we are with Victoria 3's dev diary number 15. It is 7:45. I have recorded non-stop. And we are here with slavery, of course. A very big topic, a very interesting topic in the way that it is depicted, because it is much more realistic, much more accurate in its degree that it does, and it has huge impacts on how people perceive your domestic industry. For example, you know, of course, the landowners really, really rely on those work forces, while at the same time, of course, if you were to get rid of it, you have to either look for substitutes, or you will have a massive, massive societal upheaval. As, I mean, it happens IRL, that's in real life, that's just how it is, right? But this is a big topic, both in its game mechanic, also in its depiction. I think, I personally was very, very positive about the way this is implemented, in the sense that there's a lot of potential there in terms of how the player needs and can react to. I will yet again and again say that this is like, honestly, the usage of models for pops is insane. In terms of like how it impacts you as a player, I think, in comparison to what you have going on in your regular games in, you know, Victoria 2, for example, but in any other given game as well. They have talked about a bunch of stuff with the different slavery mechanics, how you can impact it if you want to, you know, for example, as a non-slave state, invade that country. We also had our dear Mr. Beecher here, who's going to come up in the proper requirements here, so, or rather in the proper comments here. We had him mention all of that stuff going on there. Let us check out the community feedback section. This one is the longest yet out of all three today. I appreciate both paradoxes and your own desire to be sensitive about the subject of slavery, but I feel discussing the past should not have to come with 2 minutes of caveats and warnings. I feel the community around this title and other 4X games is more than educated enough to know that committing past immoral actions and wrongdoings is done by one group against another in video games does not make you immoral, much like how playing an Assassin's Creed game does not make you a murderer, nor does having a slavery in your strategy game make you a slave master. Obviously it doesn't. No, obviously it doesn't. Fundamentally, I don't disagree with this comment. Okay, I have this comment in here because it's important for me to mention it from my point of view as a content creator. Basically, I personally have sworn when I started the channel that if I ever look at my Discord or look at my YouTube and I am absolutely so embarrassed by what I see from the majority of people, I would shut it down. This is a sincere opinion. I would just say, let's call it a day. We had a good run. It was fun. Let's move on. And to not have that happen, I need to set certain expectations to my community. Some people do not meet those expectations. And I say some, because the vast majority of you obviously did not need the disclaimer early on where I said, let's be respectful about this. Let's talk about it in a civil way and let's consider what is going on. But there were enough comments. I actually responded to this comment that I disagree based on the comments that I had to remove. Some people, statistically speaking, don't get it. They don't understand what is adequate, what is socially acceptable, what is a logical behavior, and what is just complete lunacy. And I will never stop telling all of you, much like you tell me in the comments, whether you think, you know, that I don't know, I'm making a good case, whether I'm making a bad case, whether I said something stupid, whether I mispronounced something. Hyperbole will never leave me, okay? The fact that I mispronounced it. Those things are fine, right? But much like you have expectations on me, on how I argue, on how I see things, I have expectations on you. And the vast, vast majority, under this video, under any other video on this channel, gets that. But I will make it clear to everyone, so that the people that then get banned don't go, I didn't know that wasn't adequate. It's very, very simple not to make me feel embarrassed for you. If you do it, you're out. And me saying that, I think, is a certain degree of fairness so that you understand that you're out. It's that easy. So, no, basically, this is not something where you should say, oh, you're calling me a racist or whatever, right? This is something where I say we have minimum standards here, and I expect you to honor them. I will be honest with you, I'm mostly... this is not even against the person that wrote this comment. I want to make that very, very clear. This person behaves perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I want to clarify my point of view on it, that I know statistically speaking there will be people that write really dumb shit, and I don't have any tolerance for that. And to be clear about that, I think, is to be fair about it. That is why I said it. I will say it in the future as well, because I'm not interested in shutting this channel down because I feel embarrassed by the people that are part of the community. I don't feel embarrassed by any of you. Fact. The people that embarrass me just I'm not part of the community. That easy. I wanted to bring it up primarily because I understand it's a topic that you encounter in various places in real life, and not the topic of slavery, but the topic of communication and having the same expectations. You encounter it in real life and you encounter it on the internet, and I think it important that I clarify what my expectations are, much like your expectations surely are. You know, that I don't try to sell you crack on the internet. Bad example, but more like that I don't tell you opinions that aren't mine. Right? That is where I'm coming from. I think we have very clear expectations, and sometimes we should communicate them. That's how easy it is. If you don't belong to the statistics that I don't want in the community, then you're not meant. That's how it is. Brazil is an interesting relation to slavery. Slave trade is an appropriate depiction of Brazilian slave laws in 1836, but then we had a series of laws referred to as para inglês ver, which translates to just to show the English. I googled that. It's actually true. It's fascinating. Those laws were, not to doubt that it wasn't true, but what a name. Those laws were in theory anti-slavery, but were actually rarely enforced. For example, bringing slaves for Africa was prohibited, but nothing was done against smuggling. Then it was determined that slaves with 60 years or more should be free, but they usually never even reached that age. Then it was defined that sons and daughters of slaves should be free, but since their parents weren't free as well, they had to become slaves to be with them, until finally slavery was abolished in 1888. I wonder how this could be depicted in the game. So this is a really interesting question. Obviously, and this is not just true for Brazil, this is also true, for example, for Ottomans and their very specific form of slavery, but obviously you're going to have forms and developments of slavery that cannot be depicted with the system as it is in Victoria 3. This sort of half-hearted, we introduce laws, and that makes it so that on paper, slavery is gone, but in reality, it's not gone. I am not sure that this can be properly depicted. I think primarily you would be looking at a country that basically the pre-stage of passing a law would be this period where effectively, in an abstract way, I want to make that clear, it's not a realistic, it's not like the proper approximation of this, but in an abstract way, you could argue that the period of you coming closer and closer and closer to passing these laws basically includes your state being like, I don't really want to pass it right now, so I'm going to go and just act like it, right? It isn't actually that, but I do think that, like, you can abstract it like that. Whether that is fair enough, up to you. I definitely think this is a really, really interesting piece of history. In particular for Brazil, of course, and South America, let's be really, has been a bit neglected in most Paradox games because it's very difficult, I think, to do too much there compared to, like, literally World War I and all the wars, fought in Central Europe, for example. Not that there weren't many wars, and not that there wasn't much conflict in South America, not to mention that, obviously, conflict isn't what defines whether there's anything interesting there, but they've been neglected a bit, right? And I'm not sure whether this will be depicted in an actual, genuine approximation of it, but I do think you can basically, like, head role play, and that's not good, that's not much, right? But I did want to bring this up. It's a really interesting situation. I don't think it will be covered in the current system. There's still some things I wonder about. How are slaves allocated? If there are more jobs for slaves than slaves to go around, which buildings get them? Really good question. Really, really good question. How are they allocated? Usually you would go for what pays you most, but slaves don't pay you most. They did confirm that technically, if a building makes a lot of money, they might raise the standard of living, which would mean that slaves might be preferred over there. Not sure though. For workers, who gets wages? The answer was simple, whoever paid most. But slaves, by their very nature, have no ability to choose where they work. I would assume slaves go to whichever building that would pay the most for freemen, on the basis that logically they would also be willing to pay more for their human livestock. Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see that. They also confirmed, again, if you make much money from the product, since you have free workers, quote unquote, where you only have to cover the standard of living, that's how slavery works, right? In the game. In that situation, you have a situation where you can say, yeah, if you pay them a higher standard of living, maybe they get allocated there, but I'm not sure whether that is actually how it works, like how it would work in real life either. On a similar note, what happens if there are fewer jobs than slaves? For freemen, unemployment is something that can be remedied by being less picky about what job they take and accepting a pay cut, and the issues can be solved somewhat by dipping into savings, but yet again, these are luxuries denied to slaves. Are they just left to die? Or is there somebody that is assumed to be wanting them to alive to sell later, and if so, who is footing the bill? Really good question. Really good question. Honestly, I don't know. I would suspect that they might... I mean, to a degree, like, in real life circumstances, it's not really viable. Like, it's not really possible. Because in real life circumstances, somebody has to own the slaves. And that somebody wouldn't own them if they wouldn't have worked for them or if they couldn't sell them. I don't know. Maybe there is a mechanic where they can go to a different state, because so job searches, which obviously doesn't apply really to slaves, but job allocation is done via on a state level. And if you want to leave that state as a slave, obviously you can't do that freely, but maybe if you don't have enough jobs there, they are allowed to be transferred, quote unquote. Not sure. I wonder if state-owned buildings can employ slaves. Interesting question, but I assume, honestly, I assume very much, because it's a production method, right? So if you own that building and still has a if you own that building and still have a slavery law, you would be able to do it. Obviously, it wouldn't make sense for a worker-owned building doing so, or maybe it would. Answers to on a postcard, please. Or, you know, reply to the behemoth of a comment. One could argue the idea of nations sustaining a good quality of life for its citizens off the back of slaves has plenty of precedent in the classic era. On the other hand, most ideologies that espouse state ownership also view slavery as antithetical to its most basic tenets. It's true, of course, but, like, you can still have a state-directed economy and very much not be in favor of human rights. I wonder if state-owned... No, sorry. I can't remember. Have they explained why clergy are employed in some buildings? Is it just a case where there wasn't anywhere else to put them? Is it a production method choice where the owner gives a little extra in the collection plate and the preachers focus more on the submission and fealty parts of the good book, scroll, oral history and leave out the human rights parts? I would guess so. Honestly, I don't think the jobs are necessarily, self-explanatory to a degree. Because, like, listen, if you have, for example, a very rural area, you just had a distribution of priests there that were very tightly community integrated, right? Since there is no building that just says I'm a church or I'm a holy place, I don't think there is such a building anyway. Since there isn't such a building, you need to still spread them out in the areas where they were common. So basically, if you say we have a very rural area, we have some farms here, right? There may be clergy involved there. They may even be doing some administrative work, but in general, they simply were a part of the community, of the society there. So yeah, ultimately, honestly, I'm not entirely sure, but I would guess that the clergy is basically treated as, hey, we're looking at this from they were living in this environment. You mentioned the idea of the nation guaranteeing a minimum standard of living as an alternative to market economics. Worth noting, we have actually seen a UI element stating that a certain level of standard of living is being guaranteed. I believe as a government institution, there was welfare state or unemployment or something equally vague in its naming. That at level 1 implementation guaranteed a standard of living of 1, which I'm pretty sure is still starving. Yeah, it's very much bad. But who knows what properly implementing it might provide. I assume this makes up the difference if a pop fails to make enough to reach that standard of living, but I could equally see a similar system where the first X levels are paid for by the state and the rest is covered by the pop themselves. Yeah, that's actually a really cool idea. If you say, oh, that would be a cool hybrid system, oh my god, that's really cool. If you say, I guarantee level 5 for everybody, and then you actually pay level 5, and then they still get paid and can pay themselves up, depending on the pay that they have. That could be viable. That's a really cool idea. It's still, at the end of the day, what we have to realize, though, is it just looks like there isn't a market. At the end of the day, there's still a market, and the market is, can I afford doing that as a state? In a real market, a simulation here, as it is in a regular economy in Victoria 3, you still have this market, but on every business sort of tier, right? In the system that we were discussing with the standard of living, you still have that market, but it all comes down to, can the state afford it, like the government? It's the same market, but you only see one result versus you see 50 million results, right? still makes a huge difference, of course, in how your society functions, but ultimately we should not forget that it still is a, are you making a profit or are you not making a profit? You know, are you going further and further into debt every time that you move? Let me see, where were we? For whatever reason in my head, the second system would be the institutional law of child benefit, which can later be turned into replaced by universal basic income, which is basically just a child benefit, but instead of stopping when you are an adult, it changes who the money goes to, ideally anyway. I mean, this in general is like a cool idea. I think, honestly, even if you don't have this in vanilla, which you don't necessarily need to have, I think vanilla does like a good job as what it does, this could be for a mod that is more in modernity. Definitely. Cool idea. I think there may still be value in splitting a state. While yes, the goods produced may end up in a foreign market, not anymore, very likely. They confirmed it. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, the entire team, by the way. Insane that is actually possible. Martin said on Twitter, just while I was recording this, that they were thinking about changing that for a while now. Super happy. Super happy about them doing that. That's insane. But let's continue reading. Your laws likely still apply somewhat, so you are the one to collect the taxes, not the market owner. You get a say in how things are allowed to run, not the market owner, etc. It may also interact with trade, and such in ways that can be advantageous. Let's say your rival embargoes you, but not your neighbor. Buildings in your own market won't be able to sell your rivals, and won't be able to procure resources from your rival, but buildings in your neighbor's market can. And the inverse is likely also true. Those same buildings would ignore your embargoes. That's actually a cool idea. So that's actually a cool idea. Because, like, there are real-life cases, of course. It's most of the time, it is counteracted by the governments, but there easily are cases where two people say we don't trade with one another, but then obviously, so this doesn't apply to the state issue anymore, because this has been changed, this has been altered, or will be altered anyway. But let's say, for example, you know, the Fatimids and the East Roman Empire are at war, or the East Roman Empire and the Fatimids are adequate here. Historically speaking, this is also true for Amalfi and for Genoa. The republics traded with all of them. Even if the East Roman Empire said no strategic goods to the Fatimids, which, for example, wood was a strategic good, they still did it. So in a way, yeah, I mean, this happens. This was a medieval example here, of course, but this happened in real life as well. So honestly, that's a really cool thought. You could be the Venice of the world, if you will, in this game. Actually, cool idea. Good comment. Really liked it. Very interesting, very thoughtful. Appreciate it. I didn't think about what you point at the end of the video by myself, but I think they will manage it, mostly because they nearly managed. Honestly, man, we can skip all these comments. Many of the comments here, because this is from the video where we discuss slavery and the state issue. Many of the comments have been nullified by Martin Anwart. Yeah, they addressed it. They addressed the market issue. They did. In reality, it was really rare for slaves to man factories, but from what I understand, it will be possible and maybe even common in Victoria 3. I don't think it will be common. They explicitly basically state that since slaves lack the education necessary to work, for example, as an engineer, as a, whatever you need to be in a factory, especially in a more complex factory, you can't man those properly. Some more menial tasks you most certainly can do, but since slaves very deliberately do not have any level of education that would be, important here for these jobs, you would not have them have the qualifications. They could not actually be doing these jobs. It isn't viable for the slave to do it. Slaves are locked into very specific jobs, meaning that this is good if you want to maintain your rural industry, let's say in the southern states, but at some point, unless you really manage it to, like, capitalize, to monopolize the trade in certain agricultural goods, unless you're able to do that, at some point your economy will fall behind. That is just a matter of fact. Like that's just the way it is. The state system will just, okay, we can skip that. Honestly, they like completely they took the wind out of this number 15 sales, huh? So, are there laws to enhance the minimum standard of living for the slave pops? I could see a return to a situation like Rome slaves after the servile wars, where slaves are pretty well treated, so they would have a relatively good standard of living and would be expected to earn their way to freedom in their lifetime. Technically, that would be possible. I mean, in legacy slavery and whatnot, it is detailed. The longer you go, the less slaves you will have unless you are able to import them from somewhere. Or in the process of dealing with slavery, you would increase the minimum standard of living to equal the standard of living of a peasant, or enforce other slave rights, as was happening in Haiti just before during the revolution, to make the life of a slave not completely terrible while making them less economically superior to employing freemen, which is basically what you were talking about at the end, re-communist countries, but applied to the slave population. Right. This is something that I'm really eager to test out in Victoria 3. Because, and they talked about this as well, the American Civil War will be quite dynamic. You will have a situation where you are able to prevent it, you will have a situation where you will be able to accommodate it, and you will have a situation where you will have to fight it. It depends very heavily on what you do. And the base idea of this, if we play it through with what we know from the mechanics, and we know quite a bit, the base idea is, at least in a sense, what this user is suggesting. If you make it so that the slave owners in the southern states no longer rely on slaves, you will be in a position in which they will not mind slavery being made illegal. I have to assume that there is a calculation going on in the background that basically says, if this law passes, will I lose, or am I projected to lose or to gain wealth? And if they say lose and it's heavy, then they will radicalize like crazy and you will have a civil war at your doorstep. If you are able to phase them out, for example, by shifting away their wealth, by, I don't know, making it so that the industry down there is more developed, that the investors are pivoting towards more beneficial factories, for example. If you're raising the price of a slave, I mean, that will already upset them, right? But if you're raising that price, that standard of living that must be maintained, you could phase them out and then just have no civil war and pass no slavery. I really want to test that out because this is one of the most interesting, very obvious dynamics that you can have in this game, but it is reflected in every other mechanic as well. When you look at Russia, for example, they have serfdom, and taking serfdom away very similar to how slavery being taken away will make the landowners in the south much, much poorer. It would, in Russia, to take serfdom away, make the people that run the farms, etc., much, much poorer as well, so the nobility. And making this shift is the biggest project that Victoria 3 is enabling, which Victoria 2 did not really address, at least not to that degree at all. At all! I'm super eager to test it out. This is a cool thought. I would like to see how you can prevent it, how you can force it, and so on and so forth, because that is the biggest test of game mechanics right there. Really excited whenever I get my hands on the game. I really am wondering what determines... Okay, no, we already... It's solved. Wiz solved it. I just started getting into Victoria 2 earlier this week, I guess in preparation of Victoria 3. So far I'm having fun. If you haven't played Victoria 2... make sure that you have all the DLC. Make sure that you are on the beta patch that was with other people. I believe Podcat worked on it. Did Groogy work on it? I'm not sure. I know Wiz worked on it though. There's I believe it is patch 3.04. Definitely download that on Steam and then play the game. Many of the systems I will rip apart in these videos, but Victoria 2 is the best that we currently have, and it will definitely prepare the mindset. The mindset for Victoria 3, I recommend it very much. I have a number of feelings and thoughts on the implementation of slavery in CK3 in Victoria 3? I think okay. I have a number of feelings and thoughts on the implementation of slavery in Victoria 3 insofar as I can tell. On the one hand, I'm appreciative of the delicate manner in which the devs seemingly aim to deal with this topic. On the other hand, I have a few questions and potential qualms with how slavery is, as far as I can see, implemented in this game. How will slavery-like systems, most notably of course serfdom, but arguably other systems like fellahin, subjugation in Egypt, or corvée labor, use all over the world, including Ethiopia and by France during the early period of colonialism, be implemented? Particularly in the case of the fellahins and serfs, we're dealing with people who, as much as I can tell, had their freedom of movement restricted, if not disabled entirely, forced to do certain work by superiors. So, I don't think fellahin is in, it's probably just covered as serfs, but serfs are in, it's a labor law, because the idea that they had, it could be separate, yes, it could be, but generally, if you have serfdom, you don't have any further labor laws, basically. That will be in. And the other way that they do it, if you have regional slavery, but you yourself don't do slavery, is fundamentally done. For example, Spain has a very specific, I think, they have legacy slavery, I want to say. And Cuba, their colony, has slave trade, right? So basically, they can handle it this way, by giving some authority to locations that were practicing this. So I think they are addressing this quite well. This plays into a second question. How will different system of slavery be handled in this game? The slavery of the United States was different to that in Haiti, itself different to that in Brazil, itself different to that in Egypt, itself different to that in Sokoto Caliphate, and so on. There is a distinction, of course, with debt slavery and with the legacy slavery, the slave trade, and so on. But yeah, I mean, how exactly it is, you could really only simulate via the standard of living. And how much freedom you have in determining what the minimum standard of living of slaves in your country is, not sure. Slaves have origins, this is a really interesting one, often homelands far away from where they live the rest of their lives without freedom, while those who were born into the institution often boasted diverse ancestries from a number of different ethnic groups and even continents, subcontinents. How will slave populations be impacted by the contours of trades from different areas? Will diverse slave populations be represented with different origins and backgrounds, or will slaves be a sort of blanket pop of uniform, black people with singular religions, ethnic, philosophical, and ancestral makeup? I mean, it's a huge topic of the disconnect, the unrooting of cultural heritage and cultural identity. I think it plays into the same role of, voluntary migration, by which I mean is we don't know how cultures change in general, if they change location drastically, which means I have no idea how it changes if they are on a level of force, basically, right? So involuntary location change. How, if at all, is escape dealt with? I have to assume it would be a pop size, so like there would be an minus 5% because people are fleeing, and then somewhere else somebody feeds off of that and becomes free people, similar to how you have debt slavery doing something similar, but the reverse way, where free people that are poor can become debt slaves, and the pops of the free people become smaller, and the pops of the slaves become larger. I believe that is how that would be done. How would we capture the process of continued recreated subjugation of formerly enslaved populations in many countries? How would Victoria 3 systems properly simulate the trend that even after emancipation, slave systems tended to precede similar systems of economic subjugation, for example, sharecropping? What we know is that those pops will likely still be discriminated against on ethnic purposes, will have no education, and will be workers. Meaning, you will have basically this system of absolute dependency on still very much the rich shareholders, stakeholders of the country. So I think this isn't simulated as its own system, but it is simulated in the effect that somebody that is liberated has, as they are liberated, but they don't have the same privileges, which is, of course, the best example for this are the United States of America, and that means they are still in a form of dependency. So I do think this is emulated by the system that we have. Is it truly fair to create a system in which a conquered territory automatically sees a slave liberation? I mean, if you take it in a peace deal, yeah, absolutely. Obviously, if you just occupy it during a war, no. Although even about that we can talk. Even about that we should debate. I wouldn't give that a no. If Britain takes Alabama and then still loses the war, Alabama would not be the same state afterwards. Not that Britain would ever be taking Alabama, but you know what I mean, right? I actually think there's more speaking for that being more, like it not being fair currently because occupation doesn't liberate people. Because I think, yeah, it should. It did. You know, during the Civil War, for example. So, yeah, I actually think it's less fair, but not for the side that you think it is, for the other side. For the side that does the liberation. I think in accurate terms and in historical terms, it is more accurate to allow for liberation by non-slaving slaving countries, yes. If you take away the occupation question, and you want, as a non-slaving country, you want to maintain slavery there, for whatever reason, power politics, listen, it's power politics, right? You could simply have that become a vassal rather than a state of yours in the peace deal. I think that is viable and would lead to a similar situation with Spain and Cuba. Yeah. I'm not sure how I feel about slave pops having entirely zero income. I understand what the team was going for and as a result why they made their decision. But slaves did sometimes make some small or meager amount of money if they were employed in the right work as slaves, at least in America. I'll have to stress here that I'm not saying that slaves were as a whole getting paid for their work or something ridiculous like that, nor am I suggesting that this was acceptable. Especially given these people were still slaves who were liable to lose their money at the whim of another, especially in the context of the United States. It's complicated. I'm just curious about whether or not the devs aim to do anything to represent this. So I don't think so. However, and this is important, you are true that this occurred, and this is a statistical fact, but I think to simulate the greater system of slavery, it's not necessarily a thing that must be implemented. The granularity would be interesting. I would not be against it personally. Again, I'm not a dev, but I'm just saying that. But I will say, the way slavery is depicted depicts essentially the greater streams, the greater societal development that occurred. Right? So, from that point of view, it's essentially something that could be depicted maybe in like a small wealth, you know, that they could still have a wealth gain, but I don't think it would be impactful enough on a statistical level of this greater societal stream that it needs to be its own mechanic in terms of feasibility of this general game mechanic. Let's move on. Very good post again. Very thoughtful, very intricate. Maybe a split state, okay. We're done. Martin Almond nuked this section. As a black man, I think that abstracting slavery too much would have been a big mistake, and actually depicting it with fidelity will do so much more to educate the players about slavery is more than simply slavery bad, but also for its political and economical ramifications. The best homage possible is to properly integrate it into the game. This is actually a complex topic, not about like slavery, morals and whatnot. It's more about a different topic when we look at grand strategy games. I have this comment in here in particular because I've seen this discussion. It's actually a really interesting discussion. I've had it as well. We need to make one thing clear. Grand strategy games do not, at all times, attempt to depict the entirety of life at the time. CK3 does not depict anything about the struggles, or rather, it depicts it in a tangential fashion of the struggles of serfs, of people that, you know, are slaves as well in this period, in the medieval period. That's not what CK3 is about. CK3 is about character and dynastic gameplay. That is what it's about. EU4 is not about, you know, even the population as a whole, not really about that. It is about building a state via institutions and traditions, and at the same time, conquest and expansion, and that is what it's about. Hearts of Iron 4 is about warfare. That's what it's about. You have, of course, tangential, you touch on politics, you touch on population, you touch on all that, but the core of those games is always in a certain spot. And in Victoria, the core of the series is about population and society. That is what it's about, which is why I completely agree. First and foremost, it is very important to depict every single societal stream as well as possible. That's literally the purpose of the game, which is why, for example, you know, I don't know, exploration, yeah, sure, it's done via events in Victoria too, right? You spend some money, then you get lucky, but exploration is not an integral part of the game. It is a tangential part that can happen when you explore, for example, Africa during the race for it, right, when you look at it, but it is not something that is fundamental to the Victoria experience. And here is something that is important. Obviously, that means slavery must be depicted in a very specific way, but I want to point out, there are two lines of thought, I think, that must be understood, and they do seemingly oppose one another, but I don't think one destroys the other. Grand strategy games are not history education. Just because they attempt to capture certain elements like warfare, like character, like dynasties, like conquest, like state building, like societies, that is not historical education. But what we have to acknowledge is the fact that many people, especially younger ones, and listen, it is what it is. Pop culture history is what it is. If people become hungrier to learn more, that is always good. But there are people out there, for better or for worse, that take these games as a general guidance for history knowledge. And that is, again, they focus on certain things, these games, but they neglect others. Because the games have a focus, right? They are focused vision. So basically, we have this point of view where it's like, obviously it is not education, but obviously some people take it as education. So where I'm coming from on this is that there are other elements that I'm absolutely certain of the historical reality of 1836 to 1936 that Victoria 3 will neglect. And that is fine, because Victoria 3 does not have that as a focus. So I don't disagree with this comment at all. I just want to expand it by saying, I don't think every game needs to look into that direction. I think CK3, I hope it expands into more of the topics that are tangential at the moment, right? But become maybe a bigger factor afterwards. But I will say for Victoria 3, I do think it is absolutely vital. Because if you look at what the focus of this game is, it's society. And there are people out there that view it as a certain historical guidance. And if you have this focus field and neglect a central part of that focus, you would be doing the game and the players a disservice. A bit of a roundabout way, basically, to saying I think it's important to have things in that, no matter what it is, if they really are a core of what that game is about. But that is basically how I feel about it. I think, because like I see these debates, again, I'm really not disagreeing with this comment at all, but I find it important to mention. Because I see these debates between people that say it should all be in, it should not be in. I think games are not all-rounders, but when you do focus on something, you have to focus on it. That's basically my point of view. How far that focus is, that will always be a topic for debate. But I think, yeah, basically. I really just wanted to bring that across. Let's move on and see whether the next question is about states. Yes. It's weird how Paradox talks about other games putting slavery as a simple economic bonus, as they did that exact thing in EO4. EO4, in many ways, does not try to simulate population or society. It is a game about logistics, a bit about board gaming, and primarily about the state. Like how the state builds itself up and conquers. And that's what it's about. It's a map painter to a degree, and that appeals to many people. Many people love EO4. I personally, it's not for me. I've made that very, very clear numerous times, but I will say, EO4 doesn't focus on this. This is not really the focus for EO4. Victoria 3, pops, the economy, and society are its fundamental founding principles. Again, not saying EO4 is it's not my favorite game, okay? But I hope you know where I'm coming from on this. Whether that box where EO4 is should be expanded or not is a debate. But I do want to say Victoria 3 is simply a very, very, very different focused game than any other game that Grand Strategy has ever made, including Paradox games, of course. Split states, already done. A large portion of abolitionists, especially early on in the game's time frame, to the point where I'd be willing to say they were a majority or even a supermajority, found their convictions through religion. Just bringing it up, as you mentioned, wondering about it. And Lyman Beecher in particular was a Presbyterian. Very cool, didn't know that. Very much will be reading a lot of scientific articles and books on these topics as we dive into Victoria 3 as it comes out. Cool stuff, really, really cool stuff. The dynamics that are not very well known to me, because obviously it doesn't really play a role in German high school education, or Bavarian high school education in particular, of course, because we have state-based systems. I wonder how they'll handle serfdom, since it's a labor law. The response here is, looking at the forum, it will just be a labor law, disappointing. Again, I see the argument of saying I could have served them and still treat them well, but like, it's kind of outlandish. Like, it never happened. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be able to do it. I think maybe it should be adjusted, but for me personally, it's a minor thing. I just wanted to highlight that, because obviously it's valid to be disappointed by it. I really want the game to show how hard it was for countries in the Americas to abolish slavery. The US had a civil war because of it, and in Brazil, slave owners successfully managed to bring down the monarchy and establish a landowner oligarchy after the royal family abolished slavery. The only reason Brazil is a republic today is due to a single law. Over 80% of the Brazilian population opposed slavery and republicanism, and still nothing could be done. Landowners are ridiculously powerful, and Vicky 2 really failed to portray this. The civil war was more fun, more of a fun little flavor that the US had, and Brazil should just end slavery by switching a reform. Yeah. Okay, first of all, completely true. Second of all, I think I answered my point of view on this earlier when I talked about me being really fascinated by the idea of doing a peaceful transfer, right? How hard it is, whether it is viable, how it goes. But definitely a very, very valid concern, especially with Victoria 2 in mind, which didn't really do a good job at this. So I just wanted to highlight it because I think it's a valid concern. I'm surprised they went for slaves fill more work roles than laborers. One would guess it would be the other way around, as slavery is insanely ineffective. It is, statistically speaking, yeah, for sure. Not only do you have to bring in additional manpower to oversee your workers, but also slavery in the past did prove to be extremely ineffective. They have their very basic needs met, and no chance to ever improve aside from rebelling, so they are not really encouraging to work as hard as possible in many cases. A free man, who at least keeps part of what they worked for, is so much more effective and will try to be better and achieve more almost always. See, there's a distinction here. This is better for slave owners. For the population and the long-term development of the country, of the state, and of the population, it is bad. Non-slave pops will grow more. Non-slave pops will be more educated to actually modernize your industry. Non-slave pops will be paying taxes. All of that is better for the non-slave pops, for your society, for your population. But for this subsection of society, and I have these tiny, come on man, for the subsection of society that are slave owners, a slave system is better. And obviously they fill more work roles because, yeah, again, women and children have to work as well. But the core idea of this is to effectively say, we are in a situation where this is good for some and bad for others. Because that's the core idea, the trade-off idea of Victoria 3. So I get where you're coming from, but I will say you will see the ineffectiveness that you describe in the game. I'm absolutely certain of it. I share your worries, states. Okay, let's move on. We did it! Can you believe that Martin Anwar came in with from the top rope, just RKOing me out of nowhere by saying they're going to adjust markets to state borders. Oh well, they will look into it. Big fan, big fan. This was today's goddamn long but still very fun look at everything related to you know what I'm saying, to the thing. I can't even think about it. Community feedback for DevDiary 13, 14, and 15. Thank you for coming. Please leave any comments in the comment section. Have a good one. Cheers. Later. Alligator.